The boy couldn't have been older than 9. His hands trembled as he held out a nugget of raw gold, no bigger than a coin, toward the merchant. The man didn't flinch. He took the gold, tossed a plastic bottle of water across the dusty stall, and turned away. No words, no mercy, just the quiet cruelty of a country choking on thirst. This was Burkina Faso in the dry season. The rivers had long vanished. Wells coughed up sand, and the price of water had eclipsed the price of blood. But in the capital, Ouagadougou, another kind of exchange was unfolding, one that would ripple across continents. Inside a dimly lit chamber, Ibrahim Traoré stood alone at the head of a long table. Across from him sat a delegation of foreign diplomats, suits pressed, eyes cold, briefcases heavy with contracts. They spoke in clipped tones about regional stability, resource cooperation, and shared interests. But Traoré had read between the lines. They weren't here to help. They were here to own. Rumors had already begun to swirl, whispers of a water coup. That Traoré had discovered something beneath the desert, that he was hiding it, that he was planning something radical. One diplomat leaned forward, voice sharp. President Traoré, if you obstruct international access to the Sahara Basin, there will be consequences. Traoré didn't blink. He reached into his folder, pulled out a satellite image, and slid it across the table. The room fell silent. A diplomat muttered, "Is that?" Traoré nodded. "It's real, and it's ours." What he had found beneath the sand would rewrite Africa's future and send shockwaves through every Western capital. But what Traoré did next would make history and terrify the West. By the 3rd year, the drought had become more than a natural disaster. It was a reckoning. Crops failed. Livestock perished. Entire villages vanished into the dust. In Burkina Faso, water wasn't just scarce, it was sacred. And like all sacred things, it was being sold. A single barrel of clean water now cost more than a barrel of oil. Foreign corporations flooded the region, not with aid, but with contracts. They offered desalination plants, bottled imports, and privatized wells, all at a price that only the elite could afford. The poor were left to barter with gold, labor, or silence. France, once the colonial master, returned with a new face: investment firms, military advisors, and media consultants. America followed, cloaked in diplomacy but armed with satellite surveillance and strategic partnerships. Their message was clear: water was a commodity, and control was power. But whispers began to spread. That Traoré was resisting. That he had rejected every foreign deal. That he was building something underground, something massive. Western media painted him as erratic, dangerous, even delusional. Anonymous sources hinted at regime instability. Intelligence leaks suggested covert plans to restore order. Inside Burkina Faso, the tension was palpable. Traoré's speeches grew sharper. He spoke of sovereignty, of Sankara's dream, of a continent that would no longer beg for its own lifeblood. His supporters rallied in the streets, chanting, "Lo estan nous." The water is ours. And then came the leak. A classified image surfaced online, grainy, infrared, impossible to ignore. It showed a vast, dark mass beneath the Sahara. Not oil, not minerals, water. A subterranean ocean, untouched for millennia. A reservoir so vast it could quench the thirst of half the continent for generations. The world gasped. Experts scrambled. Corporations panicked. And Traoré smiled. Because buried beneath centuries of sand, they found it. They called it stabilization. But for decades, it was anything but. The coalition operated under many names: development banks, energy consortiums, diplomatic task forces. But their mission was singular: extract, control, repeat. From cobalt in the Congo to uranium in Niger, they carved Africa into zones of profit. Burkina Faso was no exception. France led the charge. Its grip on West Africa had never truly loosened. Through shadowy trade deals and military partnerships, it ensured that former colonies remained tethered to Paris, economically, politically, and psychologically. The CFA franc, still controlled by the French treasury, was a leash disguised as currency. American interests followed suit, cloaked in the language of democracy and investment. Tech giants and agribusiness firms poured into the Sahel, buying up land, installing surveillance infrastructure, and lobbying for exclusive access to natural resources. Their media arms painted it as progress. But on the ground, locals saw their rivers fenced off, their crops patented, and their leaders silenced. Then came the water crisis, and with it, a new opportunity. As the drought worsened, multinational corporations descended like vultures. Nestle, Veolia, and others offered solutions: bottled water at inflated prices, desalination plants with foreign technicians, and privatized aquifers guarded by armed contractors. The message was clear: survival came with a subscription fee. Behind closed doors, diplomats whispered of regime fatigue. Traoré was too proud, too unpredictable. He refused to play ball. He rejected IMF loans, tore up French military agreements, and nationalized key industries. Western media branded him a populist. Intelligence reports labeled him a threat. And so, the coalition began to move. They funded opposition parties. They amplified dissent online. They deployed advisors to neighboring countries. The goal wasn't war, it was erosion. Erode trust. Erode unity. Erode Traoré's grip until he was just another headline. But they miscalculated. Because Traoré wasn't just resisting, he was building. While they plotted in boardrooms, he was digging in the desert. While they debated sanctions, he was rallying engineers. While they mocked his nationalism, he was rallying engineers. While they mocked his nationalism, he was mapping the aquifer. And when the satellite image leaked, their panic was palpable. The discovery of the subterranean ocean threatened everything. It meant water independence. It meant agricultural revival. It meant geopolitical leverage. If Traoré controlled it, he could rewrite the rules, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire Sahel. The coalition scrambled. Offers turned to ultimatums. Contracts turned to threats. Media outlets ran hit pieces. Analysts warned of destabilization. But the people saw through it. They saw the arrogance, the greed, the desperation, and they saw Traoré, calm, defiant, unbought. He didn't flinch when France recalled its ambassador. He didn't bend when American envoys warned of economic isolation. He didn't blink when corporate lobbyists offered billions. Because he knew something they didn't. This wasn't just about water. It was about dignity. And they underestimated one thing: Traoré's resolve. Before the world knew him as the man who defied empires, Ibrahim Traoré was just a student, quiet, curious, and obsessed with the earth beneath his feet. At the University of Ouagadougou, he studied geology not for profit, but for purpose. While others dreamed of oil fields and mining contracts, Traoré asked a different question: what does the land want to tell us? He found his answer in the writings of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who once dared to rename an entire nation. Sankara spoke of dignity, of self-reliance, of Africa rising not through charity, but through courage. Traoré devoured every speech, every quote, every story. He didn't see a politician. He saw a blueprint. When he joined the military, it wasn't for power. It was for discipline, for structure, for the chance to protect something bigger than himself. He rose quickly, not because he was ruthless, but because he was relentless. His peers called him the quiet storm. He listened, more than he spoke. But when he did speak, people leaned in. As foreign aid poured into Burkina Faso, Traoré grew uneasy. He saw how it came with strings, how roads were built to serve foreign trucks, how schools taught foreign languages, how leaders bowed to foreign banks. He began to speak out. Not loudly, not recklessly, but with precision. "We are not poor," he once said. "We are rich in spirit, in soil, in sun. What we lack is freedom." His words spread, first among soldiers, then among students, then among farmers who had watched their wells dry, while foreign consultants flew overhead in private jets. When the drought hit, Traoré didn't wait for permission. He mobilized local engineers. He studied ancient maps. He consulted elders who remembered rivers that no longer flowed. And slowly, a vision began to form, not of resistance, but of resurrection. He rejected foreign contracts. He nationalized water infrastructure. He launched community drilling projects. Western media called him reckless. But in the villages, he was a savior. And then came the discovery. Buried beneath the Sahara, untouched for centuries, lay a vast aquifer, a hidden ocean waiting to be claimed. Traoré didn't announce it with fanfare. He didn't sell it to the highest bidder. He called a meeting. He laid out the data. And he said, simply, "This belongs to us." His advisors warned him. The West would retaliate. Corporations would panic. Diplomats would threaten. But Traoré didn't flinch. Because this wasn't just about water. It was about legacy. He stood where Sankara once stood, at the edge of possibility, staring down giants. And like Sankara, he chose defiance. But unlike Sankara, he had something the world couldn't ignore. A map. A plan. The conference room was sterile, cold, and humming with tension. Flags from 5 nations lined the walls, but the air belonged to no one. Cameras perched like vultures, waiting for a moment worth broadcasting. Ibrahim Traoré sat at the head of the table, flanked by aides who said nothing, because everything had already been said. Across from him sat the envoys. France, America, Germany. Their suits were crisp, their smiles thin. They spoke in rehearsed tones, each word dipped in diplomacy, but sharpened with threat. "We understand your position, Mr. President," said the French delegate. "But access to the Sahara Basin must remain a shared international interest." Traoré didn't respond. The American leaned forward. "Water is a global resource. You can't nationalize an aquifer that spans borders." Still silence. The German envoy tried a softer approach. "We're prepared to offer infrastructure support, technical expertise, and long-term investment. In exchange, of course, for cooperative management." Traoré finally spoke. "You mean control?" "No," the American corrected. "We mean partnership." He looked at them, one by one, and saw the same thing in every face: entitlement. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to claim. "You had your chance," Traoré said, "when our children drank from poison wells. When your companies sold us our own water. When you called our sovereignty unstable. You had your chance." The French delegate stiffened. "If you continue down this path, there will be consequences." Traoré leaned back. "There already have been." The room fell silent. Cameras rolled. The world watched. Then the accusations began. "You're weaponizing water. You're destabilizing the region. You're threatening global security." Traoré didn't flinch. He let them speak. Let them unravel. Let their polished diplomacy crack under the weight of desperation. And when they were done, when the last threat had been uttered and the last plea had been ignored, Traoré reached into his folder. He pulled out a single sheet. A satellite image. A map. He placed it on the table, turned it toward the envoys, and said nothing. The image spoke for itself. Veins of blue, stretching beneath the desert like arteries of hope. The envoys stared. The cameras zoomed. The silence deepened. Because this wasn't just a map. It was a declaration. A warning. A promise. And Traoré had just changed the rules. Then Traoré dropped the map. The map lay flat on the table, but its implications towered over every man in the room. Blue veins stretched across the parchment like lifelines. Ancient, buried, and untouched. The Sahara, long seen as a graveyard of hope, was now revealed as a cradle of rebirth. Traoré didn't speak. He let the silence do the talking. Let the diplomats squirm. Let the cameras capture every twitch, every blink, every bead of sweat. Then he stood. "This," he said, gesturing to the map, "is not a resource. It is a resurrection." The room shifted. The French delegate leaned in, eyes narrowed. Where did this data come from? Traoré turned to his aide, who stepped forward with a tablet. Satellite imaging. Ground-penetrating radar. Geological surveys conducted by our own engineers. No foreign consultants. No foreign funding. The American scoffed. "You expect us to believe your team uncovered a reservoir of this scale without international support?" Traoré didn't flinch. "We didn't need support. We needed sovereignty." He tapped the map. 500 billion cubic meters. Enough to irrigate the Sahel. Enough to end drought cycles. Enough to make Africa water independent for generations. The German envoy whispered. "If this is true, it changes everything." Traoré nodded. "It already has." He turned to the cameras. "Let the world hear this. Africa will never thirst again." The speech that followed wasn't written. It was lived. He spoke of the children who walked miles for a single bucket, of the farmers who watched their fields turn to dust, of the mothers who buried their sons because the clinic had no clean water. He spoke of betrayal, of foreign aid that came with chains, of contracts that robbed nations blind, of leaders who sold dignity for dollars. And then he spoke of Sankara. He told us to plant our own seeds, to dig our own wells, to dream our own dreams. They killed him for it. But they didn't kill the dream. He raised the map. This is our inheritance. Not from colonizers. Not from donors. From the earth itself. The room erupted, not in applause, but in electricity. The air pulsed. The cameras zoomed. The world leaned in. And then he unveiled the plan. The Blue Belt Project. A transnational initiative to harness the aquifer, build sustainable irrigation systems, and create a green corridor across the Sahel. Led by African engineers. Funded by African nations. Owned by the people. No foreign oversight. No foreign ownership. No foreign veto. He named the countries already on board. Mali, Niger, Chad, Guinea, Senegal. A belt of unity stretching across the continent. He spoke of solar-powered pumps, community-managed reservoirs, and water schools to train the next generation of hydrologists. This is not just a project, he said. It's a promise. The diplomats were stunned. Their playbook had been shredded. Their leverage evaporated. Their threats defanged. The French delegate tried one last jab. You're destabilizing the region. Traoré smiled. No, I'm hydrating it. The American warned of sanctions. The German warned of isolation. The media warned of chaos. But Traoré had already won the narrative. Social media lit up. Hashtag Bluebelt trended in 20 countries. African youth posted videos of dry wells with captions, "We're next." Artists painted murals of Traoré holding a jug of water like a torch. Musicians dropped tracks sampling his speech. The continent was awake, and the West was rattled. Because this wasn't just about water. It was about control. About a continent refusing to be managed. About a leader who didn't ask for permission. Traoré walked out of the chamber without shaking a single hand. Outside, thousands had gathered. Farmers, students, elders, children. They held signs that read, "Water is freedom, Sankara lives, and Blue Belt or bust." He climbed the steps of the National Assembly and raised the map high. "This is not mine," he said. "It is ours." The crowd roared. But the backlash was immediate and brutal. It started with a single tweet. A student in Bamako posted a photo of a cracked well with the caption, "Traoré gave us water. What did your president give you?" Within hours, hashtag Bluebelt was trending across Africa. By morning, it had crossed oceans. TikTok flooded with videos, young Africans dancing beside dry riverbeds, holding signs that read, "We're next," and "Hydrate the revolution." Instagram lit up with digital art, Traoré as a modern Moses, parting the sands to reveal a sea beneath. On YouTube, influencers broke down the aquifer data like it was a Marvel plot twist. The continent was electrified. In Dakar, thousands marched with blue flags. In Niamey, schoolchildren painted murals of the Sahara blooming with green. In N'Djamena, a local rapper dropped a track titled "Beneath the Dust," sampling Traoré's speech. Africa will never thirst again. Celebrities joined in. Lupita Nyong'o reposted the map. Burna Boy called Traoré the realest leader alive. Trevor Noah joked, "He didn't just drop the mic. He dropped an ocean." Even Rihanna tweeted a single word, "Respect." Western media scrambled. CNN ran a segment titled, "The Man Who Found Water Under Africa." The BBC questioned the data, then praised the vision. Fox News called it resource nationalism. The Economist warned of geopolitical disruption. But the people weren't listening to pundits. They were listening to each other. Mali signed on first, then Niger, then Chad. 3 nations, long divided by borders and politics, now united by thirst and hope. Engineers met across borders. Farmers shared irrigation plans. Youth groups launched water literacy campaigns. The Sahel was no longer a line of drought. It was becoming a belt of unity. Traoré's government released a statement. The Blue Belt is not a Burkinabe project. It is an African promise. And the promise was spreading. In Ethiopia, whispers of a similar aquifer emerged. In Sudan, activists demanded transparency on water deals. In Kenya, Parliament debated joining the initiative. The ripple effect was no longer regional, it was continental. But not everyone was celebrating. In Brussels, trade officials met behind closed doors. In Washington, analysts warned of strategic instability. In Paris, the Foreign Ministry issued a statement. Unilateral control of transnational resources is unacceptable. Then came the leaks. Internal memos revealed plans to freeze aid, to suspend trade agreements, to block infrastructure loans. The West wasn't just watching, it was preparing to strike back. And then came the sanctions. The sanctions came swiftly: trade freezes, suspended aid, blocked banking channels. Western leaders called it a necessary response to unilateral aggression. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood before the nation unshaken. They don't fear instability, he said. They fear a continent that can stand on its own. His voice echoed through the capital, broadcast live across Africa. He didn't flinch. He didn't soften. He spoke with the clarity of a man who had seen the cost of dependence and chosen dignity instead. They fear our engineers, our farmers, our youth. They fear our unity. Because for the first time, we are not asking. We are building. He invoked Sankara not as a martyr, but as a mirror. He told us to reject aid that enslaves, to grow what we eat, to drink from our own wells. They silenced him, but they cannot silence the soil. The Blue Belt was no longer just a project. It was a movement, a symbol, a declaration that Africa's future would not be dictated by foreign boardrooms or diplomatic ultimatums. It would be shaped by the hands of its own people. In Mali, farmers began digging new irrigation channels. In Niger, students enrolled in hydrology programs. In Chad, women's cooperatives launched water purification initiatives. Across the Sahel, the desert was no longer a curse, it was a canvas. Traoré's government released a manifesto. Water is not a commodity. It is a birthright. The Blue Belt is not for profit. It is for posterity. Western media tried to spin the story. They called it reckless, dangerous, unsustainable. But the narrative had already shifted. African journalists, artists, and influencers reclaimed the mic. They told stories of rebirth, of resilience, of a continent refusing to be pitted. And the world listened. At the African Union Summit, Traoré stood before dozens of heads of state. He didn't beg. He didn't bargain. He simply held up the map. This is not just Burkina Faso's miracle. It is Africa's inheritance. We were told to dig for oil. We dug for life. The room erupted in applause. He closed with a line that would be etched into history books, painted on murals, and sung in classrooms from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Africa's future isn't buried in sand. It flows beneath it. And with that, the tide turned. He didn't just find water. He found a future. From the cracked earth of Burkina Faso to the united voices of the Sahel, Ibrahim Traoré turned a buried ocean into a blueprint for sovereignty. The Blue Belt wasn't just a pipeline. It was a lifeline, a symbol of what happens when dignity refuses to drown beneath dependency. They tried to silence him with sanctions. They tried to shame him with headlines. But the map spoke louder than their threats. And the people, from Bamako to N'Djamena, answered with unity. This is more than a story about water. It's about reclaiming what was always ours. It's about leaders who serve, not sell. It's about a continent that refuses to be managed and chooses instead to rise. So if you believe in dignity over dependency, this is your story too. Subscribe to stay part of the movement. Share this video to amplify the message. And comment below with your own story of resistance, pride, and rebirth. Because Africa's future isn't buried in sand. It flows beneath it.